The wind cut across the porch like a blade made of winter itself, and Shara Korvath wrapped her worn cloak tighter around her shoulders as she stood in the half-light of evening, staring at the painted wooden door with its single lantern burning beside it. Her breath misted in the air, and somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the layers of wool and leather, and the muscle earned from years of shepherding on the high claims, her heart hammered so hard she thought it might crack a rib. She had walked 3 days from her grazing lands to reach this mill town, carrying nothing but a small pack and the weight of a year's worth of letters that had somehow transformed loneliness into something that felt dangerously close to hope. But standing here now, with the reality of wood and stone and lamplight before her instead of ink on paper, the fear crawled up her spine with icy fingers. Letters could lie. Words on a page could paint any picture, could promise anything, could make a man sound kind and thoughtful and genuinely interested in the life of an orc woman who spent her days alone on a hillside watching sheep move like clouds across the grass. Reality was different. Reality was the way people's eyes slid away from her tusks, small though they were, and the green of her skin that marked her as other. Reality was a lifetime of being tolerated at best, feared or despised at worst. "No one waits for me," she whispered to the cold air, the words barely more than a breath. She was already turning, already lifting one boot to take that first step back down the path, when the door swung open. He was there, framed in golden lamplight that spilled out into the darkness, and he was smiling. Not the polite stretch of lips that people managed when they wanted to seem civil, not the tight grimace of someone fulfilling an obligation, but a genuine smile that reached his eyes and made them crinkle at the corners. Henrik Quentin was broader through the shoulders than she had imagined, stocky and solid in a way that spoke of years working with heavy loads and hard labor. His hair was dark brown, touched with gray at the temples, and his face had the weathered look of a man in his 40s who had spent plenty of time outdoors. He stood roughly her height, perhaps an inch taller, perhaps an inch shorter. It was hard to tell in the doorway, but his presence felt immense in that moment, filling the space between fear and possibility. "You came," he said, and his voice carried the same warmth it had in her imagination when she read his letters, but richer somehow, deeper, more real. "I have been watching for you since noon." The words hit her like a physical thing, solid and undeniable. Since noon, he had been waiting. For her. Shara found her voice somewhere beneath the shock. "You have—" Henrik stepped back, gesturing into the house with one broad hand. "Come in from the cold, please. You must be frozen through, and I have stew on the fire and bread from this morning." His eyes moved over her face, her ears, the small tusks that protruded just slightly over her lower lip, and his expression never changed, never flickered with disgust or unease. He just kept smiling, waiting, and after a heartbeat that stretched like hours, Shara stepped forward across the threshold. The house was small but well kept, the kind of place that spoke of care rather than wealth. A fire burned in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with simple wooden shelves. The smell of cooking meat and onions filled the air, rich and savory, and her stomach clenched with sudden hunger. A table sat near the fire with 2 chairs pulled up, already set with bowls and spoons, and she realized with a start that he had prepared for her, had expected her, had made ready for her arrival as though it mattered. "I got your last letter 5 days ago," Henrik said, closing the door behind her and shutting out the wind. "When you said you would try to come this week, I thought about how long the walk would take from your claim. 3 days, maybe 4 depending on the weather, so I have been watching." He moved to the hearth, ladling stew into the bowls with practiced efficiency. "Sit." You have come a long way. Shara lowered herself into one of the chairs, feeling strange and awkward and entirely too aware of her own body in this unfamiliar space. She had spent the last year pouring her thoughts onto paper, writing about the sheep and the weather and the particular quality of silence on the high hills. And he had written back about the mill and his work and the rhythm of life in a small town. They had shared pieces of themselves in careful increments, building something she had no name for, something that lived in the space between friendship and longing. But sitting here now, watching him move around his kitchen with easy confidence, she felt the full weight of her own foolishness. What had she expected? That words on paper would translate seamlessly into this. That a human man would look at an orc woman and see someone worth wanting. He set a bowl before her and took the seat across the table, his own bowl steaming in front of him. For a moment they sat in silence, and Shara picked up her spoon with fingers that trembled only slightly. The stew was excellent, rich with meat and root vegetables, seasoned with herbs she could not quite name. She ate without speaking, filling her belly with warmth while her mind raced in circles. "Your journey was all right?" Henrik asked after a while. "No trouble on the roads were quiet," Shara managed. "Cold but clear," he nodded, tearing off a piece of bread and dipping it in his stew. "I am glad. I worried about you traveling alone in this weather." He glanced up, meeting her eyes. "I know you are capable. Your letters made that clear enough. But still, I worried." Something in her chest twisted at the casual way he spoke of worrying about her, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "Why?" The question escaped before she could stop it. "Why did you keep writing?" Henrik paused, bread halfway to his mouth, and his expression grew thoughtful. "Because your letters were honest," he said finally. "Because you wrote about things that mattered. The shape of clouds. The way newborn lambs wobble on their legs. The silence of snow falling on empty hills. You did not try to be anything other than what you are. And what you are seemed like someone I wanted to know." He took a bite, chewed, swallowed. "Why did you keep writing to me?" "Because you answered," Shara said simply. "And because you asked questions like you actually wanted to hear the answers." They finished the meal in a more comfortable quiet, and afterward Henrik cleared the bowls while Shara stood and moved to the fire, warming her hands. The heat seeped into her skin, chasing away the last of the cold, and she felt herself beginning to relax by increments. This was not what she had feared. He was not repulsed. He had waited for her, watched for her, prepared for her. It felt impossible and precious and terrifying all at once. "I have a room ready for you," Henrik said, and when she turned to look at him, he was drying his hands on a cloth, his expression carefully neutral. "Upstairs. It is small, but the bed is good and there are extra blankets. You are welcome to stay as long as you like." "I should not impose," Shara started, but he shook his head. "It is not an imposition. I want you to stay. We have a year of letters to catch up on, and I find I am not ready for you to leave after one bowl of stew." He hesitated, then added more quietly, "I have thought about meeting you for months now. Wondered what it would be like, if you would find me disappointing in person." She stared at him, this human man with his graying hair and his solid build and his open, honest face. "Disappointing." "You were waiting for me. You smiled when you opened the door. How could that be disappointing?" Something shifted in his expression, something warm and almost vulnerable. "I am glad you see it that way," he said softly. "Come, let me show you the room." He led her up a narrow staircase to the second floor, which held 2 bedrooms and a small storage space. The room he showed her was indeed small, but clean and neat, with a bed covered in a thick quilt and a window that looked out over the mill pond. A basin and pitcher sat on a wooden stand, and someone had laid a fire in the small hearth, ready to be lit, "Thank you," Shara said, setting her pack down on the bed. "This is more than I expected." Henrik lingered in the doorway, one hand on the frame. "I am glad you came," he said again. "Truly glad." "Sleep well, Shara. We can talk more in the morning." He left, pulling the door closed behind him, and she stood alone in the small room, listening to his footsteps descend the stairs. Her heart was still racing, but the fear had transmuted into something else, something that felt like the beginning of belief. She slept deeply that night, warm and safe in a stranger's house, and woke to pale sunlight filtering through the window and the smell of frying bacon drifting up from below. When she made her way downstairs, Henrik was at the stove, cooking breakfast with the same easy competence he had shown the night before. He glanced up when she entered, and that smile appeared again, warm and welcoming. "Good morning," he said. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in months," Shara admitted, and it was the truth. There was something about this house, or perhaps about the man in it, that made sleep come easily. They ate together at the table by the fire, and afterward Henrik suggested a walk through the town. The day was cold but clear, the sky a brilliant blue overhead, and Shara agreed despite her misgivings about being seen with him in public. She had faced prejudice before, knew the weight of stares and whispers, but she had also walked 3 days to meet this man, and she would not hide in his house like something shameful. The mill town was larger than she had expected, with several streets of houses and shops clustered around the mill itself, which sat beside a swift-moving river. Henrik walked beside her, not touching but close enough that she was aware of his presence, and he pointed out landmarks as they went. The bakery where he bought his bread, the smithy where he had his tools repaired, the small church with its peaked roof and wooden bell tower. People turned to look as they passed, and Shara saw the recognition in their eyes, the quick assessment of her green skin and pointed ears, the way some faces hardened while others simply looked curious. But Henrik seemed oblivious to the stares, or perhaps he simply did not care. He kept talking, kept walking, treating her as though escorting an orc woman through town were the most ordinary thing in the world. They reached the mill itself, a large wooden structure built over the river with a great wheel turning steadily in the current. Henrik led her inside, where the air was thick with the smell of grain, and the sound of grinding filled the space like thunder. He introduced her to the miller, a gruff, older man who looked her up and down with sharp eyes, and then nodded once, as though she had passed some test Shara did not know she was taking. "Good to see Henrik with company again," the miller said, his voice barely audible over the noise. "Been too quiet since Martha passed." Shara glanced at Henrik, who had mentioned his late wife in his letters, but only in passing, only with the kind of careful distance that spoke of old grief kept private. He met her eyes and gave a slight shrug, and they left the mill, stepping back out into the cold sunshine. They walked to the edge of town, where the houses gave way to fields and forest, and Henrik found a fallen log that made a decent seat. They sat together, looking back at the town with its trailing smoke and distant sounds, and for a while neither of them spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. Shara had learned from the letters that Henrik was a man who appreciated quiet, who did not need every moment filled with words. "You mentioned Martha only once," Shara said eventually. "In your third letter." Henrik nodded slowly. "It has been 4 years since she died. Fever took her in the space of a week." He stared out at the trees, his expression distant. "We had a good marriage. 20 years. She was kind and clever, and she made me laugh. But she has been gone long enough now that the grief is not so sharp. It is more like an old ache, something I carry, but it does not stop me from living." "I am sorry you lost her," Shara said. "I am too. But I am not sorry to be here now with you." He turned to look at her, and his eyes were steady. That might sound strange. It did to me at first when I realized I was looking forward to your letters more than anything else in my week. I felt guilty, like I was betraying her memory. But then I thought about what she would have said, and I knew she would have told me not to be a fool. She always said I needed people more than I admitted. Your letters never felt like betrayal to me, Shara said quietly. They felt like hope. Henrik reached over and took her hand, his fingers warm and rough with calluses. His touch was gentle, careful, and when she did not pull away, he squeezed lightly. "Good," he said. "I am glad." They sat like that for a long time, hands linked, watching the world turn slowly around them. Shara felt something settling in her chest, something that had been restless and uncertain for as long as she could remember. She had spent her adult life on the high claims, choosing solitude over the judgment of towns and villages, finding peace in the company of sheep and sky. But sitting here with Henrik's hand in hers, she realized that solitude had been a refuge, not a choice. She had been waiting without knowing it, waiting for someone who would look at her and not see a monster, not see something to be tolerated, but just see her. Over the next few days, they fell into a rhythm. Henrik worked at the mill during the mornings, and Shara walked the town or helped around the house, cooking meals and mending the curtains that had grown tattered over years of neglect. In the afternoons, they spent time together, talking or sitting in companionable silence, building on the foundation of letters with the substance of presence. He told her stories about growing up in this town, about learning the mill trade from his father, about the way the river flooded in spring and turned the valley into a temporary lake. She told him about her family, orcs who had settled in the frontier territories generations ago, about learning to shepherd from her mother, about the particular challenges of keeping predators away from the flock. He listened with the same attention he had given her letters, asking questions, remembering details, making her feel like every word mattered. But beneath the growing comfort, there was a shadow Shara had not yet spoken aloud. The boundary dispute that had been simmering for months had reached a critical point before she left her claim. Her neighbor, a human rancher named Caldwell who ran cattle on the adjacent land, had filed a formal complaint with the territorial office claiming that her grazing lands encroached on his rightful territory. He had maps, he said, old surveys that proved the boundary was miles farther east than she believed. If he won the dispute, she would lose more than half her claim, the best grazing land, the spring that kept her flock watered through the summer. She would have no choice but to move to find new land farther north or west, deeper into the territories where claims were still available but harder, more isolated, more dangerous. She had not told Henrik about this in her letters because she had not wanted to burden him with her troubles, had not wanted to seem like she was asking for help or pity. But as the days passed and her feelings for him deepened into something undeniable, the weight of the secret grew heavier. If the dispute went badly, she would be leaving this region entirely, putting hundreds of miles between them. The thought of losing him just as she had found him felt like a blade between the ribs. On the 5th evening of her visit, as they sat by the fire after supper, Henrik said, "You have been somewhere else today. Distant. Is something wrong?" Shara looked at him, this man who had fallen for her first, who had watched for her from noon, who smiled when he opened the door. She owed him honesty. "There is something I did not tell you," she said carefully, "about my claim." He set down the cup he had been holding and gave her his full attention. "Tell me now." She explained the boundary dispute, the maps, Caldwell's claim, the territorial hearing that was scheduled for late spring. She spoke steadily, keeping her voice level, but she could not quite hide the fear underneath. "If I lose, I will have to move." The land I would lose is what makes the claim viable. Without it, I cannot sustain the flock. I would have to go north, probably beyond the Keller Ridge, to find open territory. Henrik listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious as she talked. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Then he said, "How certain are you of your boundary? I have the original claim papers my mother filed 20 years ago. The description matches the land I graze. But Caldwell has maps he says are older, surveys done before the claims were opened. I do not know if they are legitimate or if he had them altered. The territorial judge will decide, and if you win, then I keep my land and my flock and nothing changes." She hesitated, but winning feels uncertain. "Caldwell has money and influence. I am an orc woman with sheep and a piece of paper." Henrik leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his face intent. "This hearing. Can you bring evidence beyond the claim papers? I have nothing else. I graze the land. I have paid the claim fees every year. But I do not have old surveys or maps. What about grazing records? Tax records? Anything that shows the boundaries you have been using?" Shara blinked. "I have never kept formal records. I know where my land ends and his begins. I know every hill and stream and stand of trees. But I have not written it down." Henrik sat back, his mind clearly working. "The territorial office keeps records. Every claim pays taxes based on the land description. If your tax payments match your mother's original claim, that is evidence of continuous use within those boundaries. And if Caldwell has been paying taxes on land that overlaps with yours, that creates a problem for his case." Hope flickered in Shara's chest, fragile and uncertain. "How would I get those records? The territorial office in Granger holds them. It is a week's ride east, maybe less if the roads are good." He met her eyes. "I could go with you. Help you find what you need." She stared at him. "You would do that?" Henrik reached out and took her hand again, the gesture becoming familiar, comforting. "Shara, these past 5 days have been the best I have had in years. Before that, your letters were the best part of my weeks. I do not want to lose this. I do not want to lose you to a boundary dispute that might be won with the right evidence. So yes, I would do that. Gladly." The blade between her ribs twisted, but now it was sharp with feeling rather than fear. "I do not know what to say. Say you will let me help. Say we will figure this out together." "All right," she whispered. "Together." They left for Granger 2 days later, after Henrik arranged for someone to cover his shifts at the mill. The journey took 6 days through country that grew progressively flatter and more open, the forests giving way to rolling grasslands dotted with isolated farmsteads. They traveled on horseback, Henrik on a sturdy bay gelding, and Shara on a roan mare he borrowed from a neighbor. The weather held cold but clear, and at night they camped beside the road, sharing a tent and sleeping in their bedrolls with the fire burning low between them. It was strange and intimate and careful all at once, this close proximity, this trust. Henrik never pressed, never assumed, but there were moments when their eyes met across the flames and the wanting was visible on both sides, held in check by something Shara could not quite name. Maybe respect. Maybe fear of moving too fast. Maybe just the desire to do this right. Granger was a rough frontier town, larger than Henrik's mill town, but still raw around the edges. The kind of place built quickly to serve the territorial offices, and the surveying crews, and the endless stream of people filing claims. The streets were mud and planks, the buildings mostly wood with a few stone structures that marked the government offices. They found a boarding house that did not turn Shara away at the door, though the woman who ran it looked her up and down with narrowed eyes before accepting Henrik's coin. They took 2 rooms, side by side, and after stabling the horses, they made their way to the territorial office. The records hall was a dim, dusty space crammed with shelves and filing cabinets that reached to the ceiling. A clerk sat at a high desk near the front, a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers. Henrik approached him with confidence, explaining what they needed, and the clerk sighed as though they had asked him to move a mountain by hand. Claim records and tax payments going back 20 years, the clerk repeated, for a property in the western districts. Do you have a claim number? Shara provided the number from her papers, and the clerk made a note. Come back tomorrow afternoon. I will see what I can find. They spent the rest of the day exploring the town, such as it was, and eating a meal at a rough tavern where the food was passable and the company rowdy. More than a few patrons stared at Shara, and one drunk man near the bar made a comment loud enough to carry. Something about orcs not belonging in human towns. Henrik turned in his seat, his expression going hard in a way Shara had not seen before. If you have something to say it clearly, Henrik said, his voice low and level. The drunk man blinked, then waved a dismissive hand. No trouble here, just talking. Good, keep it that way. They finished their meal in peace after that, and when they left the tavern, Shara said quietly, You did not need to do that. Yes, I did, Henrik said simply. No one gets to disrespect you in my hearing and walk away without answering for it. That warmth in her chest again, fierce and bright. She wanted to say something, to tell him what it meant, but the words felt too large and clumsy, so she just walked beside him in the cold evening air and let the feeling speak for itself. The next afternoon they returned to the records hall. The clerk had a stack of papers waiting, yellowed with age and covered in cramped handwriting. These are the original claim documents filed by Silva Corvath 22 years ago, the clerk said, sliding the papers across the desk. And these are the tax payment records for the same claim number, updated annually. The boundary description has remained consistent. Henrik took the papers and began reading through them with careful attention, his brow furrowed. After a moment he looked up. Do you have the claim records for the adjacent property? Owned by a man named Caldwell, the clerk sighed again but went to search the files. He returned with another set of papers. Here, filed 18 years ago. Henrik spread both sets of documents on the desk, comparing the boundary descriptions line by line. Shara watched his face, saw the moment his expression shifted. He looked up at the clerk. These boundaries overlap by nearly 3 miles. Both claims describe the same spring and the same eastern ridge. How is that possible? The clerk leaned over to look, adjusting his spectacles. That should not be possible. If there was an overlap, it should have been flagged when the second claim was filed. But it was not, Henrik said. Which means either the survey was wrong or someone altered the records. The clerk's face went pale. That is a serious accusation. I am not accusing you, Henrik said calmly. I am pointing out that there is a discrepancy, and that discrepancy is causing a boundary dispute that could result in a woman losing her rightful land. Can you check the original survey maps for this region? The clerk hesitated, then nodded. Wait here. He disappeared into the back of the records hall, and Shara moved closer to Henrik, looking down at the papers. What did you find? Henrik pointed to the boundary descriptions. Your mother's claim was filed first. The description is clear. Eastern boundary is the ridgeline above the spring. Caldwell's claim was filed 4 years later, and his eastern boundary is described the same way. Same ridge, same spring. Someone either made a mistake or deliberately filed a false claim, hoping no one would notice until it was too late. And now he is trying to say my boundaries are wrong, Shara said slowly, understanding dawning. He knows his claim overlaps. He is trying to win the dispute so he can take the land. That would be my guess, Henrik said grimly. The clerk returned carrying a large rolled map which he spread across the desk. This is the original survey map for the western districts, dated 30 years ago, before any claims were filed. He traced a line with one finger. Here is the ridge. Here is the spring. According to this map, the ridge is the natural boundary for this section. Any claim that includes the spring should have the ridge as its eastern boundary. So both claims cannot be right, Henrik said. No. Only one can include that land. And according to the filing dates, it should be the Corvath claim. The clerk straightened, his expression troubled. I will need to report this to the territorial judge. If there was an error in the filing process, it needs to be corrected. When is the hearing? Henrik asked. Scheduled for 6 weeks from now. Can you have this information ready by then? The clerk nodded. I will prepare a full report. This is exactly the kind of evidence the judge will want to see. They left the records hall with the copies the clerk had made for them, and Shara felt lighter than she had in months, as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. You did this, she said as they walked back toward the boarding house. You knew what to look for. I worked with land records a little when I was younger, Henrik said. Before I settled into the mill. I knew the territorial office would have the information if we could find it. He glanced at her, his expression soft. I am glad we came. So am I, Shara said. She wanted to say more, wanted to tell him that she was falling in love with him if she had not already fallen, that the thought of leaving him was unbearable, that he had given her more than help with a boundary dispute. But the words stuck in her throat, too big and too fragile to speak aloud in the middle of a muddy street. That night, after they returned to the boarding house and ate a simple supper in the common room, Henrik walked her to the door of her room. They stood in the narrow hallway, close enough to touch, and the air between them felt charged with everything unsaid. Thank you, Shara said quietly, for all of this, for helping, for caring. Henrik reached up and touched her face, his fingers gentle against her cheek. I do care, he said. More than I thought possible after knowing someone in person for only a handful of days. But I feel like I have known you much longer. Like the letters were just the beginning and this is where we were always headed. I feel that too, Shara whispered. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she did not, he kissed her. It was soft and careful and full of restrained longing, and when they broke apart, Shara's heart was hammering so hard she thought it might burst. Good night, Shara, Henrik said, his voice rough. Good night, Henrik. She slipped into her room and closed the door, leaning against it with her eyes shut and her whole body trembling. She had been kissed before, but never like this, never with this kind of certainty that it meant something real and lasting. She pressed her fingers to her lips and felt the smile spreading across her face, unstoppable and bright. They made the journey back to Henrik's mill town over the next 6 days, and the landscape seemed different now, full of light and possibility. They talked more easily, laughed more often, and the careful distance that had existed before Granger was gone. Henrik reached for her hand when they walked. He sat close to her by the fire at night. He kissed her again under the stars with the horses dozing nearby, and Shara felt herself opening to him in ways she had never allowed with anyone else. Trust was hard for her, earned through years of rejection and prejudice, but Henrik had proven himself over and over, and she found that she could let him in without fear. When they arrived back at his house, it felt like coming home, and that realization startled her. She had lived on her claim for years, had built her life there, but walking through Henrik's door and seeing the fire burning low in the hearth and the table set for two, she felt a belonging she had not known she craved. The weeks passed quickly after that. Shara stayed in Henrik's house, and though they kept separate rooms, the boundary between them was growing thinner. He went to work at the mill, and she took over the cooking and mending and general care of the house, finding satisfaction in the domestic work that she had always done alone on her claim. But it was different doing it for two, doing it with someone who noticed and appreciated her efforts. Henrik came home each evening and smiled at her like she was the best thing waiting in his day, and they ate together and talked and sat by the fire, and the intimacy of it all was almost overwhelming. In the 4th week, a letter arrived from the territorial office confirming that the judge had received the records report and that the boundary dispute hearing would proceed as scheduled. The letter noted that the evidence of overlapping claims would be a primary focus of the proceedings. Shara read it twice, her hands shaking slightly, and Henrik took it from her and read it himself before pulling her into his arms. "This is good news," he said into her hair. "This means they are taking it seriously." "I know," Shara said, "but I am still afraid." "That is all right. Fear does not mean you will lose. It just means you care about the outcome, and I will be there with you. You will not face this alone." The hearing was held in the territorial courthouse in Granger, and Shara and Henrik made the journey again, this time with her original claim papers and the copied records from the territorial office. The courthouse was a stone building, one of the few permanent structures in the town, and the courtroom itself was a plain space with wooden benches and a high desk where the judge sat. Caldwell was already there when they arrived, a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and an expensive coat. He looked at Shara with barely concealed disdain, his lip curling slightly when he saw her tusks and green skin. His lawyer was a sharp-faced man in a black suit who carried a leather case full of papers. The hearing began with the judge, a stern woman named Harcourt, calling both parties to present their cases. Caldwell's lawyer went first, spreading out maps and surveys and speaking in confident tones about old boundaries and rightful claims. He painted Caldwell as a hard-working rancher trying to protect his land from encroachment, and he painted Shara as a squatter who had overstepped her bounds. Shara sat through it with her jaw clenched, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Then it was her turn. She stood and presented her mother's original claim papers, speaking clearly about the land her family had worked for 2 decades. Henrik stood beside her, calm and steady, and when the judge asked about the evidence of overlapping claims, he stepped forward and presented the records they had obtained from the territorial office. He explained the discrepancy in the boundary descriptions, the filing dates, the original survey map. He spoke with authority and clarity, and the judge listened with sharp attention. When he finished, Judge Harcourt turned to Caldwell's lawyer. "Do you have an explanation for why your client's claim describes a boundary that overlaps with a claim filed 4 years earlier?" The lawyer shuffled his papers, his confidence faltering. "The surveys we relied on indicated that the boundary was correct." "But the original survey map contradicts your surveys," the judge said. "And the tax records show that Miss Corvath has been paying taxes on the disputed land since her mother filed the claim. That suggests continuous use and recognized ownership." Caldwell's lawyer tried to argue, but the judge cut him off with a wave of her hand. "I have heard enough. Based on the evidence presented, it is clear that the Corvath claim was filed first and has been maintained consistently for over 20 years. The overlapping claim filed by Mr. Caldwell appears to be in error, either through faulty surveying or intentional misrepresentation. I am ruling in favor of Miss Corvath. The boundary will be set according to the original claim description, with the eastern boundary at the ridgeline above the spring. Mr. Caldwell, you will need to adjust your land use accordingly. This hearing is concluded. The judge's gavel struck the desk, and Shara felt her knees go weak. Henrik caught her elbow, steadying her, and she looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "We won," she whispered. "You won," Henrik said, smiling. "Your land is safe." Caldwell stormed out of the courtroom without a word, his lawyer trailing behind him, but Shara barely noticed. She was too busy trying to breathe, trying to process the fact that the threat hanging over her for months was gone. Her claim was secure. She did not have to leave. She did not have to give up the land her mother had worked, the life she had built. They left the courthouse and walked through Granger in a daze, and finally, Henrik led her to the same tavern where they had eaten weeks before. He ordered drinks and food, and they sat in the corner booth, and Shara let the tears come, quiet and relieved and overwhelming. "I thought I would lose," she said when she could speak again. "I thought I would have to leave everything behind. But you did not," Henrik said gently. "And you do not." She looked at him across the table, this man who had helped her, who had traveled with her, who had stood beside her in the courtroom like it was the most natural thing in the world. "I would not have won without you. Maybe. Maybe not. But we will never know because we did this together." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Shara, I need to tell you something." Her heart skipped. I have been thinking about the future, about what happens now. You have your land and I have my mill, and those places are 6 days apart. That is not impossible, but it is not easy either." He paused, his thumb rubbing over her knuckles. "I do not want to lose you. I do not want this to end just because the dispute is over." "I do not want that either," Shara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then I have a proposal." Henrik met her eyes, and she saw the vulnerability there, the hope and the fear mixed together. "I could sell my share of the mill. Take the money and come to your claim. Build a life with you there. I know it is asking a lot. I know it means leaving behind the place I have lived my whole life. But I have been thinking about it since before we came to Granger, and the more I think, the more certain I am. I want to be with you, wherever that means living." Shara stared at him, her mind reeling. "You would do that? Leave your town, your work? The mill will run fine without me. There are others who can take my place, but I do not think I will find another you." Henrik squeezed her hand. "I am not saying we rush into anything. I am not saying we have to figure everything out tonight, but I am saying that I want a future with you, and I am willing to uproot my life to have it." The tears came again, hot and fast, and Shara did not bother to wipe them away. "I want that too," she said. "I want you with me. I want to build something together." "Then that is what we will do," Henrik said, and he stood and came around the table, pulling her to her feet and into his arms. She clung to him, burying her face in his shoulder, and felt the last of her fear dissolve into the certainty that this was real, that he meant every word, that she was not alone anymore. They stayed in Granger another day to finalize the paperwork from the hearing, and then they began the journey back to Henrik's mill town. But this time, the trip felt different. They were not just traveling, they were planning. Henrik talked about what he would need to do to sell his share of the mill, who he would talk to, how long it might take. Shara talked about her claim, about where they could build a house, about how the sheep operation worked and what help she would need once the flock grew. They dreamed aloud, painting pictures of a future that felt suddenly within reach. When they arrived back at the mill town, Henrik immediately set about making arrangements. He spoke to the miller, who agreed to buy out his share over the course of the summer. He spoke to his neighbors, arranging to sell his house and the small plot of land it sat on. He packed up his belongings, sorting through decades of accumulated life and deciding what to keep and what to let go. Shara helped, and in the process, she learned even more about him. The tools he had inherited from his father, the books he had read and reread, The small carved figures Martha had made, which he wrapped carefully and packed with reverence. He was dismantling a life, and she felt the weight of that, the sacrifice he was making for her. "Are you sure?" she asked him one evening as they sat surrounded by half-packed crates. "You are giving up so much." Henrik looked up from the box he was filling. "I am not giving up anything that matters more than you. This house is just wood and stone. The mill is just work. You are the person I want to wake up beside. You are the future I want to build. So yes, I am sure." Shara crossed the room and knelt beside him, taking his face in her hands. "I love you," she said, the words finally breaking free. "I have been afraid to say it, afraid it was too soon or too much, but I love you, Henrik." His eyes went bright and he kissed her, deep and fierce and full of everything he felt. "I love you too," he said when they broke apart. "I have loved you since the third letter, I think. Maybe sooner. You were the light in my days. And now you are the reason I am willing to leave everything else behind." They made love that night, slow and tender and full of discovery, learning each other's bodies the way they had learned each other's minds through letters and conversation. It was not perfect or practiced, but it was real, and when they lay tangled together afterward, Shara felt a peace she had never known. This was what it meant to be wanted. This was what it meant to belong. The process of selling the mill share and the house took weeks, but finally, as spring softened into early summer, everything was settled. Henrik had his money, his possessions packed into a wagon, and his goodbyes said. The town gathered to see him off, and there were handshakes and well wishes and a few misty eyes. The miller clapped him on the shoulder and told him he was a fool to leave, but a lucky fool if the smile on his face was any indication. Henrik just laughed and climbed up onto the wagon seat, offering his hand to Shara. She took it and let him pull her up beside him, and together they drove out of town, heading west toward her claim. The journey took 5 days, the wagon slower than horses alone, but Shara did not mind. She sat beside Henrik, watching the landscape change from mill country to the open hills she knew so well, and felt anticipation building in her chest. When they finally crested the ridge and looked down into the valley where her claim sat, green and rolling under the summer sun, she heard Henrik draw in a sharp breath. "This is beautiful," he said quietly. "This is home," Shara replied. They drove down into the valley and Shara pointed out the landmarks, the spring that fed the creek, the high pastures where the sheep grazed, the small stone cabin she had built with her mother years ago, weathered but solid. Henrik took it all in, his eyes moving over the land with the careful attention of someone assessing a new place, and then he smiled. "We have work to do," he said, "but we will make this into something great." And they did. Over the summer and into the fall, they worked side by side to expand the cabin into a proper house. Henrik had skills with carpentry that Shara lacked, and she had knowledge of the land and the flock that he was eager to learn. They built walls and laid floors and raised a roof, and slowly the house took shape, large enough for two with space for the future. They argued sometimes, small disagreements about where a window should go or how to frame a door, but they learned to compromise, to listen to each other, to build not just a house but a partnership. The sheep thrived under their joint care. Henrik proved to have a knack for animal husbandry, and he took to the work with enthusiasm. He built better pens and repaired the shearing shed and helped Shara deliver lambs when the ewes gave birth in the spring. The flock grew, and with it, their income. They sold wool and meat at the markets in the nearest town, and people who had once looked at Shara with suspicion began to nod and greet her, and Henrik beside her, as though they were just another couple making a life on the frontier. By the time winter came around again, the house was finished. It stood on a rise overlooking the valley, built of stone and wood with a wide porch and large windows that let in the light. Inside, it was warm and comfortable, furnished with the pieces Henrik had brought from his old house and new things they had made together. Shara hung curtains in the windows and laid rugs on the floors, and Henrik built shelves for his books and a large table where they could eat and work and sit together in the evenings. One night, as snow began to fall softly outside, they sat by the fire in their new house, and Henrik got up and went to one of the crates he had not yet fully unpacked. He pulled out a wooden frame and brought it to the light. Inside the frame was a letter, carefully preserved behind glass. Shara leaned closer and saw her own handwriting, the words she had written more than a year ago in what felt like another lifetime. "This was the first letter you sent me," Henrik said. "The one where you described watching the sunrise from the high pasture and feeling like you were the only person in the world. I read it a dozen times before I wrote back, trying to figure out what to say to someone who could see beauty in solitude but still reached out to connect." He hung the frame on the wall above the mantel, where the firelight made the glass gleam. "I want to remember how this started, how we found each other through words on a page." Shara stood and moved to his side, looking at the framed letter. "I never thought anyone would care about the things I wrote. I never thought someone would wait for me." Henrik put his arm around her waist, pulling her close. "I will always wait for you," he said, "and I will always be here to open the door smiling when you come home." She leaned her head on his shoulder, looking at the letter, at the life they had built, at the fire burning warm and steady in the hearth. This was more than she had dreamed possible. This was the answer to every quiet hope she had whispered to herself in the darkness. She had been alone for so long, believing that no one would see past the green skin and the tusks and the otherness. But Henrik had seen her, truly seen her, and he had chosen her, and he had remade his life to be with her. The winter passed in quiet contentment. They stayed close to the house during the worst of the storms, venturing out only to care for the sheep and bring in firewood. They cooked together and read by the fire and made love under heavy blankets while the wind howled outside. Henrik taught Shara the card games he had played as a child, and she taught him the songs her mother had sung, orc ballads about the mountains and the sky and the long roads that led to home. They talked about the future, about expanding the flock, about maybe taking in a few cattle, about the possibility of children someday if they were blessed. The conversations were easy and full of hope, and Shara found herself smiling more than she ever had, her face aching with the unaccustomed expression of joy. Spring came with a rush of green and the sound of lambs bleating in the pens. The flock had grown over the winter, and there was more work than ever, but they managed it together, falling into a rhythm that felt natural and right. Henrik proved himself over and over, not just with the physical labor but with the small kindnesses. He brought her tea in the mornings before she was fully awake. He rubbed her shoulders when she was tired. He listened when she needed to talk and gave her space when she needed silence. He was steady and solid and utterly dependable, and Shara loved him more with every passing day. One morning in late spring, as they stood on the porch watching the sun rise over the valley, Henrik said, "I have been thinking about what?" Shara asked, leaning against the railing, "About making this official." He turned to look at her, and there was a nervousness in his expression that she rarely saw. "I know we are already committed. I know we have built this life together, but I want to marry you, Shara. I want to stand up in front of whoever will witness it and say that you are mine and I am yours, formally and forever." Shara's breath caught. "You want to marry me?" "I do. More than I have wanted anything." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple ring, silver with a small green stone set in the center. "I had this made in town last month. The stone is jade. I thought it suited you. He held it out, his hand steady despite the nerves in his eyes. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," Shara said, the word coming without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." Henrik slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her, and Shara felt the last piece of her guarded heart fall into place. She was loved. She was chosen. She was home. They married a month later in the small church in the nearest town, the same church where Henrik had been christened as a baby and where he had married Martha decades before. The ceremony was simple, attended by a handful of neighbors and townsfolk who had come to respect the orc woman and the human man who had built a life together on the frontier. The priest spoke the words of binding, and Henrik and Shara repeated their vows, promising to love and honor each other for all their days. When the priest pronounced them married, Henrik kissed her with such tenderness that Shara felt tears slip down her cheeks. Afterward, they held a small celebration at the house, with food and drink and music provided by a fiddler from town. People danced on the porch and in the yard, and Shara found herself swept into the dancing by Henrik, who twirled her around with surprising grace. She laughed, breathless and happy, and when the song ended, he dipped her low and kissed her again to the cheers of their guests. As the sun set and the guests began to leave, Shara and Henrik stood on the porch, waving goodbye. When the last wagon had disappeared down the road, they turned to each other, alone again in the golden light of evening. "Hello, wife," Henrik said, grinning. "Hello, husband," Shara replied, unable to stop smiling. They went inside and closed the door, and the house was quiet and warm and theirs. That night they lay together in their bed, tangled in each other, and Shara thought about the journey that had brought them here. The letters, the fear. The moment she had stood on his porch, whispering that no one waits for her, and the way he had opened the door smiling, proving her wrong in the best possible way. "I am glad you kept writing to me," she said softly into the darkness. "I am glad you wrote back," Henrik replied. "And I am glad you came to meet me, and I am glad you let me follow you here. I am glad for all of it, every step, because it led to this." Shara pressed a kiss to his shoulder. I love you too, always." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other and the certainty that they had found something rare and precious. The future stretched out before them, full of work and challenges and the everyday struggles of life on the frontier, but they would face it together. "No one waits for me," Shara had whispered, but she had been wrong. Henrik had waited. He had watched for her from noon, had opened the door smiling, and had proven that love could be found even in the most unexpected places, even between an orc woman and a human man who had started as strangers bound only by words on a page. The seasons turned, and their life together deepened. They worked the land and tended the flock and built something lasting. They had their disagreements and their hard days, but they also had laughter and tenderness, and the quiet satisfaction of a partnership that worked. The house filled with the signs of their life. Henrik's tools hung by the door, Shara's weaving on the loom in the corner, the framed letter still above the mantel, a reminder of where they had begun. Years later, when Shara looked back on that winter night when she had stood on Henrik's porch, cold and afraid and ready to turn away, she marveled at how close she had come to missing this, how close she had come to letting fear win. But Henrik had opened the door smiling, and that smile had changed everything. It had been the first real proof that someone could see her and want her, that she was worth waiting for, worth choosing, worth loving. And every day after, Henrik proved it again. In the way he looked at her over breakfast, in the way he reached for her hand when they walked the high pastures, in the way he built their life with steady, patient hands, shaping it into something beautiful and strong. He had fallen first, and he had fallen hard, and he had never once wavered. Shara had fallen too, slower and more carefully, her heart guarded by years of rejection and loneliness. But Henrik had been patient, had given her the space to trust, and when she finally let herself fall, she fell completely. And she had never regretted it, not for a single moment. On a summer evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sheep graze in the valley below, Shara leaned her head on Henrik's shoulder and said, "Thank you for waiting for me." Henrik turned and kissed the top of her head. "Thank you for letting me," he replied. And then, with the warmth that had never faded, he added, "I would do it all again, 1,000 times over, just to have this." Shara smiled, her heart full to bursting. "So would I," she whispered. "So would I." The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, and the world felt perfect in its simplicity. They had found each other against all odds, two people reaching across the divide of species and expectation and fear, and they had built a love that was real and lasting. The letters had started it, but the life they lived together sustained it, day by day, moment by moment, choice by choice. And as darkness fell and the stars began to appear overhead, Shara and Henrik sat together in the home they had made, surrounded by the land they tended and the life they had fought for. And they knew with absolute certainty that they were exactly where they were meant to be together always, for all the days to come.